Okay, so we're going to talk about a variety of major topics of economic indicators: GDP, productivity, employment, prices and inflation, the flow of funds, the Conference Board, census high-frequency data, and production data, or industrial sector data. Let's start with GDP. Comes from a measurement system in the United States called the National Income and Product Accounts. It's not on your slide. There's a similar system to that in various countries around the world. They call it SNA, System of National Accounts. Pretty much the same thing around the world, various countries. So what kinds of data are included in this system? Gross domestic product itself, components of GDP, gross domestic product, and it can get very, very detailed. Price deflators, or prices for each of those components, are also included in this data set. Then there's personal income, and there's various kinds of personal income, right? Personal income can come from wages or somewhere else, and the full breakdowns of personal income are available, as well as outlays, household outlays. Then there's corporate profits, and that's broken out a number of ways. We have the government sector is next. Receipts, expenditures, various kinds of receipts and expenditures. Then there's savings and investment data, and then foreign transactions. So what you might realize by now, and if you don't, I'll let you know, this is a big, big data set. Thousands of variables, measured quarterly since 1947, measured annually since 1929. A lot of data here, and it's for free. It's at bea.gov. Okay, let's talk about GDP itself for a minute. It's a broad measure of economic activity. It's the broadest measure that's typically used both in economic analysis and as watched by financial markets. It's available at either the quarterly or annual frequency, but not at the monthly frequency. I'll talk more about that. It is a flow type measure. So suppose you're looking at annual GDP data for 2009. What I mean by saying it's a flow indicator is it takes activity that might be happening in January of 2009 as well as what's happening in February of 2009 and all the way through all 12 months. And it's an accumulator, right, of all the activity happening in each month, if you will, of that year, of the year 2009. So that's what we mean by a flow indicator. It measures the market value of things, or it attempts to. The folks who create this data actually sometimes have to estimate the market value. There might be a good or a service out there where there isn't an actual market where that good or service is being traded, or it's not being traded often enough to make it easy for the government to collect that data. So sometimes they estimate the market value. And the other point is it's both goods and services. So goods include computers, combs, cars, flashlight, and services. Examples of services: haircuts, laundering services, dog daycare services, and a whole variety of other things. In recent decades in the United States economy and in many developed economies, services have grown a lot more rapidly than goods. And so the services share of GDP has become much, much larger in the United States. Last thing for this slide, the GDP data are estimated. We would like to know exactly what GDP is, but we do not. The government estimates that number. All right, next slide. So let's talk for a second about these estimates. Like I said, the finest or highest frequency you can get GDP data is at the quarterly frequency. So the question you might have is, we're sitting in January right now, fourth quarter of 2015 has ended. It ended December 31st, 2015. We're at January 22nd right now. When will the first estimate of fourth quarter 2015 U.S. GDP be available? The answer is about another week and a half. So they take about a month, slightly less normally, of time to come up with the estimates for the quarter that just ended. That's called the first estimate. Then they take another month to refine that estimate. Then they take yet another month to refine the estimate to create a third estimate of GDP. But because of the nature of the database systems at the national level, they get more accurate readings on certain segments of the economy even after that. So then they'll make additional revisions, and those are annual revisions. They're done every July. Then there's even more data that comes out years after the fact. That leads to what are called benchmark revisions. And benchmark revisions are interesting because they can go way back in time. They can restate historical data way back in time. A lot of people don't know this about GDP. So it's a full-time job almost, just keeping up with GDP and all of its revisions. Okay, the most famous way to break GDP down, and it can yield insights, is the expenditure decomposition, so-called. So you can think of GDP as the sum of all different kinds of expenditures in the economy. And if you can succeed in adding up all these different expenditures, then you've got total expenditures. That's also GDP. So the first major component is consumption, and economists like to use a capital letter C to denote consumption. The next is investment, capital letter I for investment. And then the next is government expenditures. We use a capital G for that. Then we have the foreign sector, and we use a capital NX for that. That stands for net exports. So another way to think about C, I, G, and NX is who is it that's doing the spending. So for C, or consumption, that's households. For I, that's firms. For G, that's the public sector. So let's go back to C and I. Both C and I are private sector. Private sector households first, private sector firms second. G is public sector. What's interesting about G is it has what you might call G, C, and GI, right? G has both public sector consumption in it as well as public sector investment. So if the government pays for a nicer carpet in the Oval Office, that's G sub C, if you want to call it G sub C. That's a consumption component, but it's a public sector item, and so it's in G. If the government builds a road, that's investment. That's like GI, if you will, but that's also in G. Okay, so consumption and investment on the private sector side are split out according to this formula, but they are not for the government. Then there's the foreign sector. So net exports is defined as exports minus imports. And we subtract imports because it's not the market value of goods and services produced in this country. That's part of the definition of GDP. It's produced somewhere else. And if we're spending money on it, economists say, well, you have to subtract that out. So that's what we do. It's exports minus imports. Okay, from a financial markets perspective, it might be interesting to think about volatility. In financial markets, and for those people that watch financial market indicators like interest rates, equity market indicators, other things, volatility is often an interesting way to think about what's happening in the economy and in financial markets. So in GDP, consumption is the smoothest, by far, indicator. Investment is by far the most volatile indicator. Government expenditures, the volatility of that is somewhere in between consumption and investment. And net exports is more volatile than government expenditure, but less volatile than investment. What does that mean? What's your takeaway from this? If you see a quarter, if you see some new GDP data come out, and you see a quarter where investment's a big giant number, you're not necessarily going to think of that in the same way as compared with consumption being a big giant number, right? Because investment is volatile anyway. So when you have more volatile data like that, and you're watching it and you're tracking it over time, you do yourself a favor with more volatile data by saying, when you see a quarter, say, that's way up, by saying to yourself, you know what, I'm going to wait and see a couple more quarters of data before I come to some conclusion that there's been some big shift in the economy with respect to investment. Okay, GDP is great stuff. It's our broadest measure of economic activity. What's the problem with it? It doesn't come out often enough, fast enough. What I mean by that, it would be great if it came out on a monthly basis, right? If we could get the estimated GDP for the United States economy in January of 2016, and then the GDP estimate for February of 2016, and March, and so on. But we don't get that. After the end of March, after March 31st, 2016, about a month after that, in fact, we'll get the estimate of first quarter, which includes all of January and February and March combined. People have access to a lot of monthly as well as weekly and even daily indicators on the economy. Financial markets data particularly can be had daily or even hourly. And then there's a number of economic indicators that are available at the monthly frequency. And there are some, not many, that are available at the weekly frequency. And so because of that, it's natural for a person to want to also look at GDP, at least monthly. But it is not available. So size matters. GDP is an important statistic, an important indicator because it's broad. But timing matters too. And we have to wait 3 months before we see new information about a quarter that occurred recently. As a result, the next part of this lecture, once we're done with this slide, will go into what we call in economics higher frequency data. That's monthly frequency data, largely with maybe one weekly indicator thrown in. And those include jobs, unemployment, production and capacity utilization indexes, various kinds of factory orders. There's advanced durable orders and there's other kinds. Prices, so the CPI, the PPI. The CPI is the consumer price index, the PPI is the producer price index. Leading indicators. So leading indicators can be mixtures of some of the other indicators in this list, but they're selected in such a way so that, because we believe that together this set of indicators, right? Talk more about that later, about what those are, but we think this set of carefully chosen indicators lead the economy itself. ISM indexes, so these are indexes that come out every month. And what's interesting about these indexes, they're not just tied to the manufacturing part of the economy. Remember a few slides ago, we talked about how services has grown and become a large component of the United States economy. So while manufacturing is often tracked closely because it's a high value added sector, the services sector is actually a very, very important one. The ISM indexes, they have two. One for the manufacturing side. They also have one for the services side. This is important in our modern economy. Real estate market from 2008, pretty much everyone agrees now that real estate is an important indicator, not just for tracking real estate, but for keeping an eye on the health of a macroeconomy, right? Real estate matters to macroeconomy. And then there's a weekly indicator, the unemployment insurance claims.